Hey,
Hey, Mikaela, how are you?
I'm good. Sorry, technical difficulties.
No worries at all.
Yeah.
Welcome. And you're actually just in time. I was about to start doing introductions, so I'll very briefly start with myself. My name's Hannah. I'm the co-founder of Shado. Shado is a multimedia platform working towards social change and operating at the intersection of arts, activism, and academia. But today is not about me, it's about my brilliant panel, who I will leave to introduce themselves, as they'll do a much better job, I'm sure. And in no particular order, but because you're in this order on my Zoom screen, can we start with Samia?
Yeah, of course. Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be here. Thank you to Shadow Mag for inviting me to be on this panel with great other women who do amazing work. Yeah, my name is Samia, and I basically became part of the environmental movement when I was younger because I was passionate about air pollution in East London. Not passionate that it exists, but passionate that it shouldn't exist. And yeah, I started with a group of other young activists, initiative called Our Air, Our Health. And this was just to lobby against local councils to introduce legislations to cut down air pollution, particularly air pollution that is prominent in Black and Asian neighborhoods in London. And then after that, I started Seize the Vote with some friends because we just felt that more young people need to understand how politics affects their lives, but also grant them the space to process how politics affects their lives. Because I feel like we don't really get that space, and that has consequences in the way that we vote and the way we approach politics. And yeah, I'm gonna keep it there. But in general, I'm a climate justice activist, and I just want everyone to understand how every community is interconnected, and that's where I stand. Thank you.
Thanks, Samia. And Teju, can we go to you next?
Yes, hi all. I'm Teju, calling in from Oakland, California. I am a writer, poet, and geographer, and my focus is largely on Black geographies, urban ecologies, environmental justice, and climate justice. And so really connecting the dots across issues transnationally, locally, and thinking about regenerative alternatives to extractive capitalism and focusing on community initiatives as well.
Thanks so much. And it's great to have a voice from the US. And Jocelyn, can I hear from you next?
Hi everyone, I'm Jocelyn. I run Climate in Colour, which is an online education platform and community, basically trying to make conversations around climate more accessible, but also more diverse. And I'm also studying for a PhD, an integrated master's and PhD, applying AI to climate change issues, and very recently sort of honed in my area, which will be on forest ecologies and sort of democratic engagement with forests of Indigenous people, using AI techniques for sort of carbon sequestration solutions in that space. But yeah, I guess environmental racism, to me, what makes the most sense to me in understanding that is sacrifice zones, and not in sort of the usual way, but just that there are areas in the world, in high-income countries and low-income countries, where certain people, usually Black, Indigenous, brown people, people with disabilities, people on the margins, who are laid to sacrifice for the supposed benefit of the rest of society. And these are mainly economic sacrifices and mainly environmental sacrifices. And in terms of race, that's where we come into it.
Thanks so much. That was a brilliant introduction. And I know we'll go more into kind of delving into the terminology as well. But for now, Mikaela, could I just get your introduction, please? And then we'll get going.
Hi, I'm Mikaela Loach. I have been involved in climate organising with groups like previously Extinction Rebellion Scotland, but not anymore, and Climate Camp Scotland, which is a grassroots organisation that basically is like trying to get climate justice from like a Scottish perspective and work with local communities. I am co-host of the Eggs podcast. You can see our lovely logo over there, which talks all about climate justice and anti-oppression, and how do we link all these issues, and how do we make sure that we're having an intersectional approach, and also how do we make all of these conversations accessible and inclusive so that folks who might have never kind of approached these issues before can also kind of be included in the conversation, and there can be less maybe gatekeeping of activist spaces and those conversations. So yeah, a lot of my work is around like connecting racial justice and other kind of oppressive anti-oppression struggles with the climate crisis and climate justice as a principle. And I'm so honoured and excited to be sharing this space with all of you, because I think all of you are so amazing and cool. And I'm so excited to have this conversation. Yeah, I'm super honoured to be here.
Well, definitely not as honoured as I am to be hosting. So thank you so much all for coming. I thought I would dive straight into what Joycelyn was previously saying and ask for all of your kind of separate definitions of what environmental racism means. It's a term coined by civil rights leader Benjamin Chavis, and I wanted to know what you thought of the term, how you define it, and how you use it in your different contexts. And can we start with Mikaela? Just heard from you.
Okay, go straight in. So I think of like environmental racism as an issue, and also even like the title of this event, like why Black Lives Matter and environmental racism, or however it was phrased. I think we kind of need to go beyond the idea of environmental racism being an add-on to our climate work, or even the idea, or even having to constantly propose the idea that Black Lives Matter to the climate movement, because Black lives more than matter, and Black lives are more than like an add-on to climate movements as a whole. Oppression, especially the oppression of Black communities and communities of colour worldwide, like has been almost like at the root of the climate crisis that we see today. When I think of environmental racism, I don't only think of, so obviously there are impacts that are disproportionate on communities of colour, and especially on the Black community within Western countries. But also if we look at it on like a global scale of which communities are being impacted by the climate crisis the most, which communities are experiencing the brunt of the impacts of this crisis the most, they are communities of colour. They're countries which are predominantly like previously colonised countries, or countries, we're going to talk about like terminology later on, but I prefer saying previously colonised or global south, or whatever kind of terminology people want. But if we think about even like, why has the climate crisis been allowed to get to the point where we're at now? Like, why has it been able to get to this point? It's because the impacts were being felt in the majority on communities of colour and on these nations, global south nations, previously colonised nations. If the impacts of the climate crisis were being felt as imminently upon the white population and upon white majority countries, I don't think we'd be in this position right now. And that is what environmental racism is, and that's environmental racism in action. I think that like all of our movements will be reflected upon the world that we exist in, and we exist in a world which is built upon white supremacy, and therefore that is going to manifest itself in all these other spaces. And that's why we can't kind of separate these two things. And Joycelyn does amazing work about talking about climate colonialism, and like how colonization and colonialism is like at the root of the climate crisis in its creation, and therefore environmental racism is the climate crisis. These things can't be separated from each other. So yeah, I think that we need to make sure we're always, when we're talking about this as well, we're looking at it in like a global scale, as well as looking at it within these kind of Western countries that we personally reside in.
Absolutely. And Joycelyn, actually, would you like to kind of come in on what Mikaela was just saying about some of the definitions that you very helpfully provide for your audience?
Yeah, I mean, I won't take up too much time because I agree, predominantly with what Mikaela said. And just to define more specifically what I meant by sacrifice zones, just in case I wasn't that clear. These are just usually, in an economic sense, they're termed as geographic areas that have been sort of disproportionately or permanently, and most of the time unjustly, sort of impaired by environmental damage, and in most cases economic disinvestment. And I guess I just take that a bit further, because I don't think that all of that encompasses how far the sort of sacrificial nature and state of our world sort of runs on because of capitalist society. And it's those who are seen to be winning, making decisions for people, usually on the margins, elsewhere, without really knowing what they're experiencing. And I think there's a really interesting video. It's a bit sciencey, so don't watch it if you don't like science, but it's just basically a simulation of CO2 being emitted around the world. It's a year in CO2. And you can see these really heavy, huge production sites that are really red over the US and over the UK and other areas. And then you can see the fact that our atmosphere is circulating, like it's not still. The CO2 that is emitted above the UK doesn't stay in the UK. And you can literally see the environmental racism of the CO2 circulating over Africa, circulating over South America, where there has not previously been intense carbon production. So for anyone who maybe the environmental racism space is new to you, even just watching that simulation of carbon, like it's nothing else, just carbon circulating around the world, and how that gets moved and distributed to previously colonized areas, low-income countries from high-income countries, is a good enough demonstration for me.
Thanks so much. And Teju or Samir, I don't mind who comes in first. If you want to raise a hand, if you want to come in.
Sure, I will go. I believe that all racism is environmental because we can't separate ourselves from the environments that we live in. And part of the exclusion of the environmental movement is separating nature from humans and conservation from environmental justice. And so I think it's important to note that the extraction economy that we currently live in is predicated upon racism. The extraction of natural resources on the continent of Africa, in Latin America, the use of slave labor in all the Americas, Africans enslaved labor particularly created the situation of climate change that we're currently in. So they're not really inextricable. So environmental racism essentially is that Black people around the world disproportionately are impacted by toxins, pollution, and climate change, which I think is a fine definition. In my opinion, all racism is environmental. And in the case of climate change, particularly as everyone has said, countries that are of the global majority, meaning post-colonial countries, people of color are disproportionately bearing the brunt of climate change consequences that they did not produce through the mass industrialization and overconsumption of the Western worlds. And I also want to comment on something that Jocelyn said about people of color in Western countries and in non-Western countries being disproportionately impacted. There's a term for that called the fourth world, which is putting into conversation this idea that even in developing countries, what we incorrectly call developing countries, there are people who are living in substandard conditions, who have low quality of life, who don't have access to adequate clean water or healthcare, and have a lot of pollution and toxins. So across the world, Black communities are disproportionately impacted by things that are negatively connected to environmental extraction, such as pollution, toxins, natural disasters. And so that is how I understand environmental racism, as racism in and of itself, but in this case, as it pertains to the environment and the climate changing.
Thank you so much for that. I think it's really interesting, kind of, we've all touched on it. So Samir, I'd love kind of for you to kind of give your definition of environmental racism, but also I'd love to talk a little bit about language when we're talking about the climate crisis, when we're talking about environmental racism as a systemic issue. There are going to be words that leave people out there and exclude people, and there are going to be words which don't sit comfortably with people. So how do we create a language that is accessible and inclusive for everyone?
Yeah, thank you for all the contributions so far. Like, it's literally what I was like thinking in my head, but then yeah, like everyone brought in some helpful and useful points. And if you asked me what environmental racism was when I was a teenager, and you described it to me, I'll just say, oh, racism. Like, that is just racism to me. And I remember as I like progressed through the movement, like meeting different activists across the world and talk about my experiences as a Black woman, but also a Black woman who grew up in inner city London, where there's high levels of environmental classism and racism, where that was just my lived experience. And then when people talked about environmental racism, I realized, oh, this is how I get white environmentalists interested in the fact that we live in a racist system. And even till this day, I even debate if I should call it environmental racism or just simply racism. I understand the need for it, but I realized that the term kind of like coddles like white environmentalists into the conversation, like, oh, hey, like you weren't listening when we talk about racism, but here's a brand new package, environmental racism. Like, this is more of your language. And yeah, this is something I'm still grappling with. Like, I'm not saying that I'm completely against or for the term, but my own definition is when you're depriving racialized communities of adequate ecosystem services and goods. So meaning that you're not providing clean air, you're not providing clean water, you're not providing food security, and all the other things that nourish our communities. And what you end up doing is lessening the quality of life of those communities. And that's exactly what Teju just said. And for me, is when you kill the land, you kill the people. Because I truly believe the environment is almost like the foundation to our livelihoods, because you can't have a society or economy without the environment. It's just not possible. Like, the environment is the foundation and a pillar for everything that we know and love, like, and use every single day. And moving on to your question about the terms, as a geographer, when I was growing up, like, Global South was taught to me as a derogatory term. To us geographers, it's like geographically inaccurate to say global north, global south, but we understand why other people in other disciplines use that term, because it just makes it easier to talk about different economies. But with me, when I talk about case studies, I tend to be specific about the country or the continent or whatever that case might be. And in my collective diaspora dialogues, we're grappling with this. And we were like going through a list of like words and combinations, what could be best. We talked about land exploited countries. We said resource pillage countries. We wanted to create a language where the onus is on the perpetrators of environmental racism and the perpetrators of capitalism. Because when we talk about global south, global north, like, yeah, we get the general picture. People and communities are disadvantaged by the climate crisis. They're feeling the harshest like impacts of it. But it kind of like escapes the accountability when we say global north, because we group these countries together like Europe, US, and we need to be more specific about who are these exact players in the game that are causing the like turmoils in our communities. I don't want to go like into like different case studies, because as we know, there's like plenty. I'm gonna go into them later. But yeah, we need to be more specific when we talk about these case studies, because you end up doing the communities impacted by the climate crisis like injustice if you're not specific about the struggles. Like, grouping the struggles actually causes more harm than good, no matter how well intentioned you are. So personally, from a geographer's perspective, name the countries, like point your fingers at the corporations, the people, the big scary people who are causing this harm on our communities. And yeah, I don't want to take up too much time. Pass it over.
No, thank you so much. I'm really glad you touched on that, because I know previously you've said that you kind of don't sit well with the term Global South, and I think it's really useful. I mean, I know that it is a term that is used in different disciplines, but I think it's really useful to always interrogate kind of new words we should use and why we shouldn't use the terms we are using. So I think it's incredibly important to speak that. And does anyone want to wave at me if they want to come in on that particular point, because I know everyone was nodding along.
I think, as Samia said it all, and I would just add also that some of these terms that group countries together are inaccurate, because New Zealand, Australia, and Chile are in the global south, and they're economically rich countries that benefit from extraction. And we also know that China does a lot of extractive projects in the continent of Africa and in the Caribbean. And so a lot of these terms not only are a disservice to the communities impacted, but completely obscure the differences in the ways people are impacted based on their geographies, based on what natural resources are around them, based on how much money and visibility their country has. I'm Jamaican American, and Jamaica is a relatively small island nation, but it has a lot of visibility because of dancehall and reggae. And so although there's a lot of visibility in that way, there have been a lot of hurricanes that have come through the Caribbean. There's been a lot of torrential raining and flooding that is a direct result of climate change and a direct result of the colonialism that created the consequences that we are now experiencing. But when we talk about Jamaica as an island, we rarely hear about Jamaica and climate change or the climate reparations movement, which is not just about reparations for the descendants of slavery, but reparations for the way that colonialism and tourism has impacted Jamaica's landscape and its natural resources. And so I think when we talk specifically, as Sumia said, about where we are using case studies from which places and what people are impacted, then we're able to fully understand that this is not a sort of umbrella term for policies we're debating. It's actually about life and death in many parts of the world, as I said, in the global majority, which are mostly brown and Black people.
Thank you. And Jocelyn, I know you had your hand up. Oh, I believe Teju might have said it all. Brilliant, thanks. And well, in that case, I think we've talked about, I'd almost say it's sort of like whitewashing the language to make kind of white people feel more comfortable talking about racism. But I wanted to talk a bit about whitewashing within the climate movement itself, because that in itself will, of course, feed into environmental racism. And again, I don't mind who starts, but I would love to know a bit about people's thoughts of kind of the whitewashing of the environmental movement. Yeah, Mikaela, I'd love to start with you.
I'm happy to comment. Also, I'm also Jamaican, just to say. This is not that, but I was like, woo, yay, yeah. So whitewashing in the climate movement. I would say like whitewashing is obviously a huge issue in the climate movement, because there are like a lot of white people who are taking up a lot of space in a movement, and are kind of like the public facing like part of a movement, which means I think people think that the whole climate movement is just like these white people, because the public facing side of it is a lot of white people. And my experience within a lot of climate groups that I've like subsequently left and like removed myself from those spaces is anytime that like racism was brought up as an issue, it was like, we can't dilute the message. We can't dilute the message because people already can't deal with the climate crisis, don't want to confuse them with racism. And I heard that so many times, and it just kind of like gets exhausting. And I think that this is why a lot of these like quote unquote like more public facing, or the ones that the media like more, these climate groups, the reason why they are overwhelmingly white, or appear to be overwhelmingly white, is that the people of color that join these groups like just don't want to be there because they're exhausted, and they're exhausted of like having to constantly explain their reason for being to these people. There was a really good article by Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson that came out in the summer, where she talked about how basically like white people need to step up and do anti-racism work, because Black folks in the climate movement just want to be able to get on with climate work without having to constantly educate all the white people around them on racism, on like what racism is, and etc. And she used a quote from Toni Morrison, which I can't remember directly, but it's basically talking about how one of the sole functions and central functions of racism is distraction. Like it gets you explaining over and over your reason for being, and prevents you from actually just doing your work. And so I would say that like the whitewashing of the climate movement has happened in the ways in which people of color have been pushed out of these movements, or these like more public facing movements, but also how like power is such a, even within movements that are trying to dismantle like systems of oppression or dismantle these kind of issues, power still plays like such a central role, and resources plays such a central role. And if we look at throughout history, or even today, like who holds the most power, who historically has held the most power to resources, because a movement needs resources in different ways as well. And so I think that like there hasn't been a fair distribution of resources, and therefore like through public facing ways, or even through like what kind of things manage to make the most like visible change, that's still kind of being hoarded by a small group of people. And then I think, sorry, this is a bit of a side note, but I think the same kind of similar people who have said things about like not wanting to dilute the movement have since the summer been like, oh, now I care about racism because I finally realized it exists. And it's like, nothing, at least for me personally, nothing has changed as in like from any of these people or from interacting with any of these people or within the movement at all. Nothing has changed. Like not a single thing has really changed apart from that people are being quite performative with these things. So I think like maybe kind of trying to direct more to like a solution around like how do we move away from this like whitewashing of the climate movement and how do we try and make these spaces more open. I think this requires us to realize, and not us, but like people generally in the climate movement to realize that anti-racism work is climate work, and you can't separate those two things. And therefore, if what we want to do is create more inclusive movements that acknowledge the work of communities of color, like who've been doing this work, but not in a public facing way for so much longer, then we also have to be in solidarity with these groups' struggles. So, and not just when it's convenient, not just when it's like attractive, not just when it like helps your personal goal, just all the time. Because yeah, whether people have seen it or not, communities of colour have been fighting this fight for so much longer. If we think about Indigenous activists who have been doing this work with no choice in the matter, it's not like they've decided to do it. A lot of the time it's literally life or death, and having to do that work. And so it hasn't just been like white hippies who've been doing climate work for so long. It's been so many different communities all over the world. And I will stop speaking before I take up too much time. Someone else can jump in.
Thanks, Mikaela. Yes, Samir, should we go to you? And I just wanted to kind of add, Mikaela obviously touched upon kind of everything that has been going on since last summer, well, and before last summer, but with the Black Lives Matter movement. And it would be interesting to kind of get your perspective on whether that's changed the people around you's views on racism and environmental racism, as we know it's all the same.
Yeah, thank you, Mikaela, for saying that. I just had like a flashback of the photo incident with Greta and Vanessa Nakate, and it brings me to like the point about who is providing the platform for the people within the climate justice movement, because I'm blessed to be in spaces where people are aware of their privileges, they're aware that they need to pass the mic, and obviously there's always room for improvement in those spaces. But then once we do get to that point, that ideal point of passing the mic, it's like, who are the people behind like sharing these stories, like providing like that literal stage and the photo ops of the movement? It becomes like a system, an issue with the system that we live in. And I feel like I'm just in like a infinite loop of like, oh, we have this issue. Okay, we kind of solved it. Oh wait, we live in a system that's inherently racist. So yeah, it's something that I've definitely had to reflect and evaluate on, like whose spaces do I value? Like I love paying attention to indie media outlets, like people who write their own narratives, who create their own, kind of like Shadow Mag, literally. Like I want to invest my time and my effort and my alliances with those types of things, because I think we need to tell ourselves that we need to step back from like the major publications. But then on the other hand, it's like, how do you raise awareness of environmental like justice like to the wider masses? And it's something that transitioning away from oppressive structures is a lot of work. It's easier said than done. And we are trying to dismantle centuries worth of systems and structures that do not serve us. And yeah, I just want people to think like, who do we value as the people like telling our narratives? Like, yeah, this is just something I'm still reflecting on. So I don't know, I just wanted to raise that point. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Samir. And Jocelyn, do you have anything to add to kind of what's already been said on that?
Yeah, but Mikaela, do you want to add something in real quick?
I was just going to add something just off the back of what Samir was saying about like who gets chosen to be kind of platformed, because like, for example, in the last year, like my platform has increased significantly, but I'm also very aware that I'm a very palatable Black person for a lot of people, because while I'm racialized as Black in the UK, like I'm mixed race, I'm much lighter skinned than a lot of people. Like I also have class privilege and loads of other things. And so, and yet loads of people will be like, oh my gosh, wow, like that's amazing that you're getting platforms. It's like, this should be like, it shouldn't even be the bare minimum. This is like below the bare minimum. And so, and it's people making choices of who becomes the face of a movement or who becomes the face of that. Like Greta Thunberg was chosen. Obviously, she's done amazing things. I'm not devaluing her work at all, but they chose her over an Indigenous rights activist who is young and who's been chaining themselves to pipelines for ages, because they don't want to like publicize radical work in the same way. They choose people who are more palatable to be platformed. And I even had experiences in Extinction Rebellion where I was like tokenized so much, like they'd literally, someone would be like recording something and they'd get a camera over and be like, look, there is a Black woman here. And then as soon as I'd try and start speaking, they'd take the camera off me. So it was like, oh, she's here, but we don't actually want to hear what she has to say. And that's not just like in that group, I'm sure that's happened to many people, but I'm just saying that like, when you, whatever you see about a movement, you're seeing chosen parts, and those things have been selected by, like in the UK, most of the media is owned by 5 billionaires. So like there are people choosing what narratives to present to people. So don't just believe the public facing stuff that you see. Sorry to jump in again, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I guess my answer is a little bit obscure, but it does link into what Mikaela said earlier about some of the work I've been doing, sort of educating on the colonial roots of climate change, and also the ways in which climate change influenced, well, not climate change, the climate influenced colonialism. Climate was a huge influencer of colonialism. It literally was like an arrow saying, go here, enslave these people, get this, you know, resource. And if you keep your eye out on my socials, there's something coming up soon that will kind of give you access to more of that. So I won't say too much about that now, but basically the whitewashing of the environment, I think, does come from the colonial period, because that was the time in which we saw Indigenous knowledge pushed out, and in its place, science, so climatology and meteorology, those were seen as environmental movements. Those were what were seen as, oh, if someone was a naturalist or a climatologist, they were people who loved being outdoors. They were people who cared about nature. They were the people who were invested in the climates and the forests and the mountains and the glaciers, etc. And those spaces, for how long, have been blocked out, have been sort of cut off from people of colour. I mean, I'm on a climate course and I'm the only Black person, and that's pretty normal. Like environmental sciences as an academic subject is really low on the sort of diversity front. So I guess in a roundabout way, I'm saying that, like everyone else has said, it's a system and it's programmed to be this way. Black knowledge was already pushed out 200 years ago. Blackface, which means that Black faces were pushed out. Anything to do with Black people was already meant to be pushed out of the environmental space. And obviously the climate movement stems out of that environmental space, even though most of the time that movement hasn't actually experienced climate change or negative environmental impacts, and it is the Black communities that have had to protest because of no choice, because it's literally affecting their health. And so those two movements are coming from very separate motivations, and one is sort of honoured a lot more than the other. And this again has to do with a lot of the elitism around science and academia and what is counted as knowledge that's acceptable and knowledge that isn't acceptable. And I think that we're seeing that play out in sort of public spaces as well, especially on social media. I know we've got a social media question coming up later, so I'll save my answer for that. But I think we need to all question how much we're being influenced by these sort of media spaces. And is the climate movement an Instagram page? I don't know. Like, yes, that it's all part of it, but it should be going further. Like, get off your phone and like meet the climate movement. Like, I don't know if that just sounds too obvious, but the climate movement are those people around you who care about the climate. It's not just people online, and it's not just people who have thousands and thousands of followers. Like climate action is happening in every community around the world. You just need to like go outside and find those people and make sure that they're diverse.
Can I add to just something that Jocelyn said about Indigenous knowledge being pushed out? I also want to add that along with Indigenous knowledge being pushed out, there was an appropriation of African knowledges from the slaves that was appropriated by white colonial settlers and created in this institution of science, which completely erased them from the conversations about agricultural technologies, about plant medicine, about plant science. So most of the enslaved Africans who were brought over to the Americas were brought specifically because of their agricultural knowledges and skills. Most of the enslaved Africans knew much more than the European colonial settlers because they were coming from tropical Africa, which had a climate more similar to the Americas. So European settlers actually did not have a lot of resources, knowledge, or understanding about how to deal with tropical climates, what plants actually were able to be imported there, what plants didn't work well. And that's why the US switched from tobacco to cotton, because tobacco completely depleted the soil much faster than cotton did. And enslaved Africans knew that. Enslaved Africans knew how to clear lands. They knew how to plant diverse crops. They knew about grazing practices that allowed you to regenerate the soil after you've planted. So all of this knowledge was appropriated into farming science, into agricultural science by white colonial settlers, completely erasing the fact that without the enslaved Africans and the indigenous people who would clear the land before that, there would not be a plantation economy possible, allowing places in Europe to have sugar, to have tea, to have spices, to have medicines. So it's not only the exclusion of indigenous knowledge, it's the appropriation of African knowledge and the institutionalization of science, which has excluded Black people. And so similarly, when we talk about the environmental movement versus the environmental justice movement, the environmental justice movement was on the heels of the civil rights movement. It coincided with decolonization in the Caribbean and Africa, asking for management and control over their resources. It coincided with migrations of Black people from the US South to the US Northwest and East, and Caribbean people from the islands to the UK to work in factories in Manchester and Liverpool. So the environmental movement as it started in this era is very much about Black communities and communities of color trying to gain access and create better environments for themselves in the wake of globalization and after the legacy of slavery and colonialism that had existed. And then in the late 60s and 70s, white people took this up and they said, we need to have clean air, we need to save the whales. They completely derailed the conversation from people to animals and wildlife, things that can't talk back, that can't ask for rights, that don't make them feel guilty about their whiteness and about their privilege, and made it an environmental movement. The media was behind them because the media is run by white people, and it became this huge thing that white people care about the environment, and the environment is not about people. And similarly, when we see permaculture, agroecology, all of these sustainable agricultural practices, which are based on indigenous practices from New Zealand, indigenous practices from tropical Africa, cultural burning from Californian Indians, all of these new age sustainable practices are actually indigenous Black and indigenous Indian American practices that have also been institutionalized into permaculture, institutionalized into these larger overarching sustainable conversations that again are predicated upon excluding people like us. And so this is folded into what it means to be an influencer and who has influence, who has clout, what conversations you want to highlight, who's more palatable, who makes white people feel less guilty. And what I like to think about is I'm not interested in white guilt, I'm interested in accountability. How do we move to a place of collective accountability? If white guilt and white fragility is the first step of that, that's great. Come to me when you've gotten past that and you're at the point of collective accountability. And so the exclusion is intentional. And so it means that people like us who are on the panel who have been talking about these interconnections, who have been talking in an intersectional way because we don't have a choice, because we're political, because we are Black, because we have this history, that we are now said, oh, these people, where are the Black voices? Who are the Black people? And all of a sudden we're here, but we've been here. So, you know, welcome, but we've been here. And so I think part of the conversation is how do we tell people there's been writing, resources, books, podcasts, oral histories about all of these things that we're saying. Please educate yourself, listen to those, and then join us in this conversation so we can actually move forward. As someone said, racism is the baseline. So if that's where we're at right now, then it's going to take us much longer to start having solutions than it has. So I just wanted to add on to that.
Thank you so much. That was so brilliantly put. I'm so aware that the time is slipping away from us. Jocelyn, I know you mentioned kind of using social media and kind of online spaces for activism. And Teju, as you kind of were just talking about, like, what are we amplifying? Like, who are we amplifying? I wondered whether we could switch our focus onto that in the last few minutes we have before I'll be accepting some questions from our lovely audience. So Jocelyn, could I start with you, just as you had a point to add to that?
Yeah, thanks. Social media is such a tricky one for me, especially because I didn't sort of plan to get an audience or a platform. I was doing the work just because I wanted to do the work. And I think that as a very private person, I sometimes don't understand the obsession around people on Instagram, people's opinions on Instagram, and sort of people who have platforms as a consumer of media. And I think that with sort of influencers, there's a very, people feel entitled to others who have platforms. People also like to add labels without sort of consulting the person that they're adding a label to. And I think that this is stuff that I sort of struggle with and that I've recently spoken about, that I'm an academic and I'm also many other things. I'm not what someone else wants to call me on a certain platform, and I'm here to do a very specific set of work. I believe that everyone has a role in this movement. People are activists, people are healers, people are musicians, people are artists, people are researchers. There are so many roles that everyone has. You don't have to be all of them. And just because someone has a platform on social media doesn't mean that they have to be all of them. They are allowed to do the work in the space that they feel a calling to do that work in. And I think that a lot of people also feel like social media is like the last step in their activist role, you know, as a consumer of information, and that's just not enough. Like, we need to take that off social media. There's only so much you can do on social media, and actually I have a private community on Patreon, and the conversation there is just slapping too hard, and you don't have those conversations on Instagram. Instagram is a very combative space, but actually when you can move into a space of compassion where everyone knows what their flaws are, everyone knows what their privilege, and we're actually ready to start and have a conversation, that's where we make the most progress. And I think that we need to expand our mind of what a community is, what community means, and what communication means, because I don't think much very good communication is happening on social media, and that you can't reach the bounds of what really impactful, actionable sort of communication can be, which has been happening offline, as we've said, for so many times, for years and years and years. And so I think we need to sort of step back, calm down, take a breath, and really connect back with actual people and understand that this is a tool which is part of the movement that we can use in conjunction with lots of other tools, but it's not the end all or be all. And that's for someone who follows someone with a big platform, that's with someone who holds a big platform, that's for everyone who's using the space. That I think there should be some sort of collective understanding of where that space sits within the movement, and then what other spaces are kind of linked away from that, whether they're in person, which we can't do now, but more personal spaces. And I feel like really connecting to your locality, your local community, as well as learning about what's going on around the world, but actually going out and doing something and not being complacent about online action, we could really be getting more things done. So yeah, that's all I've got to say.
Thanks. Samir, yeah, I'll go to you now.
Yeah, I really like the word you just used there, Jocelyn, like compassion. I think that's definitely what's missing from the conversations we've had. I feel like, don't get me wrong, there's like good of social media. Like I met amazing activists across the world because of social media, and I'm getting lots of knowledge and information just because of it. But then you have the other side where people are going tit for tat. It's like making activism a competition. And then it brings in this conversation about like bringing your ego into community work, which is something that I'm passionately against. Because I like to center my activism around collectivism and joy, reminding people that, kind of like what Jocelyn said, like everyone has a role in this movement, and we bring our strengths together to make this movement stronger and more impactful, to create better, sustainable futures for everyone. And yeah, I think this is like something that we need to like hammer in the movement, and we need to, yeah, just put our guard down. And I think the reason why we're having rigid conversations is because we kind of internalize like the systems around us. Like, for example, if you're applying for a job, like you list all your qualifications, like you're fighting against the other applicants, like you're always in a hustle mode. Like it's survival of the fittest. It's like, oh, every man for himself, because I need to earn money to pay my bills, to have rent, to, you know, just have a basic life. And I think, again, this is where my loop comes back in, where it's like I feel like I'm trapped in a loop where I want to do this amazing work, but we live in a system where opportunities become monetized and commodified, and it puts people in a hard place where they have to question their ethics and morals, and sometimes that goes out of the way. And I've seen that in past examples with some activists where they've actually lost what they started with, like they lost the aims that they had, and it's really unfortunate. And I don't blame them for that, because they are in the system that creates that, and this is something that we need to dismantle. And yeah, sorry to like sound depressing and doom and gloom about this, but it is the reality. These are the systems that we do live in. And I think this is kind of where I want the movement to go in the direction, like questioning the systems that we live in, not just talk about the systems that cause harm in other communities. Like, let's talk about what's harming our communities right here, right now. What is stopping me from doing authentic work for the community and for our futures? And I think then we can unravel and uproot these harmful systems. But again, things take time, and this is easier said than done. And this is why compassion is needed, because we need to understand that people are impacted by the systems we're trying to dismantle and work against. We've got these forces working against each other, and we need to understand and have patience for our movement. And yeah, like Jocelyn said, stand back, just and actually do the work. Yeah.
Capitalism is depressing. I mean, it's very depressing if you live in a world where everything that you do is connected to financial value. And if it doesn't have a monetary value, then it's not seen as productive, like rest, right? And so when social media is bought by huge corporations like Facebook, and it becomes about monetization, then everyone's relationship to that platform is going to be, how can I monetize this or support people who are monetizing this? And I think what capitalism does is it distracts from the real work, like racism. And so when you have platforms like Instagram, a lot of people will DM me on Instagram and say, thank you for your work. And I'm like, have you read any of the articles I've written? Do you know any of the community work that I've done? Do you know any of the organizations I'm consulting? My work is not Instagram. My work is outside of Instagram. As Jocelyn said, it's a tool. And so I think what also happens is that these tools are turned into the work which devalues the actual work. We go to social media rather than community organizing. And that's sort of a problem. And I think what also tends to happen is that it gets in the way of those of us who can do the work based on the size of our platform. I'll never forget, I was making a proposal to do a storytelling workshop for women of color who are activists to help them think about what their climate change story was. And the response was, oh, we love your proposal, but we want someone with a bigger platform. And I was like, well, what does that have to do with actually encouraging women of color who are activists like me to think about how their environmental relationships has been impacted by climate change? What does my platform actually have to do with the actual work of relating to people like me and thinking about how we're impacted by climate change? And so in this sort of overemphasizing of what happens on social media, some of us who are doing the work outside of social media are forced back into this sort of loop of the work is social media, but it's not. But in order to do the work, we have to be on social media. And so I think for me personally, that is my sort of tension with Instagram, is that I think it's a great tool to share about what I'm doing and to share ideas and to meet people. A lot of the work that I did before was traveling to communities, and I would often find activists and people on Instagram and then go meet them in person and see what they're doing in person. And it was such a huge tool for that for me. And now it's not the same, but I still, like, I've never met Samia or Jocelyn or Mikaela, but now I'm able to follow their work through social media, which I appreciate. But I don't want the work that I'm able to do to be curtailed by not being an Instagram influencer. And so I think it's this balance between using it as a tool and a resource, and then also making sure that it uplifts, supports, and highlights the work rather than derails from it.
Thank you so much. And Mikaela, I definitely want to come to you on this, especially because I know you've spoken about kind of rest as something that's radical and something that's deeply important to the movement. But just before I go to that, I wanted to tell our audience that this is your last chance to get some questions in, which I'll ask our panel before we leave. So thank you. And yeah, Mikaela, can I go to you on this?
Yeah, I also want to challenge something. So I think social media can also be work. I think that it, like, to run and connect people through social media and to educate people through social media can also be work. I think in the way that we talk about activism being done in so many different ways, I think that social media can also be someone's way of doing activism. Like, for example, it's more accessible to so many different communities as well as a way to communicate with people. Also, you can communicate with like really vast audiences. It shouldn't be that the work is dependent upon social media, but social media is a form of doing the work, I think, in some ways, because like running platforms does take like an amount of like knowledge and time and skill sets that I think that some people have that might not have the same skill sets that might be better used, I don't know, in another setting. And also depending on where people live, like, or like if they have a disability or something, like there are different kind of barriers that can prevent people from getting involved in like community organizing, like directly in where they live. And so that's why I think that social media can, I just don't, I think that I can also sometimes do this, but I just don't think that social media itself should be completely devalued as like social media isn't allowed to be work, because I do think it is work and it is so useful, and for mobilizing movements and for like decolonizing our minds as well as society. Like I think that social media can be like really, really important in that way. So I just wanted to challenge that like a bit, because you don't have to have a platform or use Instagram or whatever to do the work. Obviously, there are so many people doing activism in other ways, but I do think that social media is also an aspect that we can't like completely devalue. Otherwise, we're having this like hierarchy of work, which is kind of like contradictory to the argument that we're trying to put against social media, if that makes sense. That's just my like little challenge. But around rest and like rest being important, yeah, I think that obviously rest is so important, something I've talked about a lot, and something I've tried to like reflect on a lot more recently, because I think I have, probably like many other people, have this conflict of like, oh yeah, rest, like I need to rest is important, rest is resistance, and then the next minute I'll be like, but there's so much going on in the world and I also hold privilege in different ways and therefore I should be working all the time, otherwise I'm like being not great with my time. But I just think when we talk about sustainability, also it means sustainability like for ourselves as well as for the planet or the world, because we're also part of that, and part of that means making sure that we are healthy humans for the longer term. And depending on our life experiences, depending on who we are, we'll have different like traumas to unpack, and that takes, and you have to give yourself and your body the time to unpack that, and the time to rest, and the time to like do all these different things. Like I wrote a post today about why rest is resistance, and about Black power naps, and about kind of the sleep gap between the white community and the Black community that's been recorded, and like sleep and rest being reparations, because even the space to dream and imagine is something that we get when we rest and when we sleep, because our brain allows us to process big ideas and to reimagine big ideas in that time, and that's been denied from especially the Black community for so long. And therefore, like, allowing yourself that space will also help with like futurism, and like, how do we imagine these new futures? How do we give ourselves the space to imagine what we'll be doing when this future comes? And so I think that's part of the reason why I think like rest is super, super important. And I still think I find that Joe, who hosts the podcast with me, we both talk a lot about how we find it hard to sometimes balance, like saying like, yeah, rest is resistance, and then being like, but the wrong people are going to take that on and just not do anything. And it's like, how do we hold these two things together? But I don't know, I'm still not sure the best way to communicate it, but I think it's still, I'm hoping that the right people will hear the message and take a break who needs to take a break, and that the other people will be like, okay, how can I take on some work and also have like valuable rest rather than commodified rest, which we kind of have seen in capital, or commodified self-care, which has become a thing with it under capitalism. So yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. I've got a few questions through from our audience, and so I will start with one which is quite hopeful. It's saying, when it comes to kind of the Fridays for Future movement and the younger climate movements, are we seeing more inclusivity in these, and do you think this is reflective of things going in the right direction? I'm happy for anyone to come in on this.
I can just say I thought it was really important when Greta Thunberg mentioned colonialism as one of the drivers of climate change, and that very small act in and of itself opened up the space for other young people to join the conversation who have been doing this work, but maybe who have been overlooked as a result of the legacies of these things. So I would say, to me, that was an opening. And again, it's about where are we looking? If we're looking in mainstream media, then that was an opening, but there have been youth in Southern Africa, on the continent of Africa and East Africa, doing this type of work for a long, long time. So I think it's inclusive in as so much that because of social media, as Mikaela said, we're able to see more of the types of people doing this type of work, even though there's still unequal distribution of who has a platform. We're still able to see more examples and stories and narratives of people doing this work, and young people especially. So I think there is a sort of opening and diversity that's becoming more apparent and more visible. And I hope that it turns into power dynamics shifting as well, and media dynamics shifting as well.
Thank you. And kind of to wrap up, quite a few people have asked whether our panel are hopeful for the future and what takeaways they might be able to kind of leave us with in terms of work that we can all do. So if I could just have a short something from everyone on that. Can I start with maybe Mikaela?
No, I've spoken a lot recently, so someone else should go first, and I can go after them.
Okay, Jocelyn.
Hey, yeah. My, I guess, whole spiritual ethos is around praying for hope and being hopeful and being positive, and that's really what my platform's about. And that's not a naive hopefulness or a naive positivity. It's sort of, I combine a lot of different sort of spiritual practices to understand that you can understand the reality and the difficulty with a situation and still be hopeful. And this is something that I see, especially from the Black women in my life, the Black older women in my life. You see thing after thing go wrong, but there's still hope there on a spiritual level that you are being looked after and you are on the path that you're supposed to be on. And that's just my perspective on life. So of course, yeah, I'm very hopeful. My work is to be hopeful. Online work is to be hopeful. My academic work is to be hopeful. And that's what's going to hopefully mean that I can make some change. Yeah.
Thank you. And Samia, how about you? Are you hopeful for the future?
I've always been hopeful, like despite what life throws at me. But yeah, like I am hopeful because whenever I do anything that's to do with my activism, I remind myself that I am fighting the fight to preserve joy, not just for myself, but for other communities. This is why we do the work, is because we want to guard our happiness. We want to guard the things that keep us going, essentially. And I think that's the core, like the very core of my activism. And yeah, I've been more hopeful, like just by the movement itself, like across the world, just seeing what people are doing, like from little actions to big actions, and how all these actions like come together and propel the movement forward. And that gives me hope. Many things give me hope, but I will say the movement gives me hope. Yeah.
Okay, and Teju, can we go with you as well?
Yeah, this is generations long work. I feel like climate justice, environmental justice, racial justice is hope work. It's making a world that we hope will still be able to support human life generations down the line. So in the act of doing it, in the act of being in activism, you are hopelessly charging forward, knowing that every day you'll be able to wake up and still live. And I think especially as a Black woman, hope is living every day because we're so close to death all the time that to live and exist is hope. So I only do this because I'm hopeful and because I know it's generations long work and because I know that my grandmother did things for me in the 50s that she would never even know that I am experiencing today and I'm learning from today, and I'm able to be where I am today because of what she did in colonial Jamaica and in post-colonial Jamaica and what my grandmother did before I was born. So I think I like to think of my own ancestors as examples of hope and imagining beyond the world that they can see, and I try to do the same.
Thanks so much. And Mikaela, do you want to just round us off?
I agree with like what everyone said, and that's just so beautiful and moving. And I want to say that like all of you give me hope. Like having this conversation gives me hope, because I just like I've been challenged and my brain's been like, oh my gosh, wow. And like, but also it's been a space where I feel like we can just be honest and like we've shared ideas. I think this sharing of ideas and connecting with other individuals who also care about these things like as much as you do, if not more, that's what gives me so much hope. Like I think sometimes we can feel really alone and be like, I'm the only person who cares. And it's like, but that's obviously such like an egocentric, weird thing that we can think sometimes. But it's when we share this, when we're in community in whatever space that is, whether it's like having conversations like this, or it's actually in organizing groups, or it's just like connecting with other people who really, really care, like that's what really gives me hope. Because yeah, these are generational struggles, like these are generational traditions of resisting, and like seeing how all of those different things has changed over time. Whilst it might not have changed as quickly as we want it, it still gives me hope in different ways. And seeing people, like I always say that like the reason that Andra Davis gives me loads of hope is because she hasn't stopped doing this work for like half a century. And if she can do this for half a century and still have hope for the future, then like obviously I can have hope for the future. If she can still challenge herself to envision an even better world than she was envisioning like 20 years ago or 50 years ago, then I can challenge myself to like push further and always hope for better and always expect more. And we can kind of keep going, and we can keep like sharing in this tradition and constantly resisting and constantly hoping for a new world. And yeah, as everyone said, I don't think any of us would do this work if we didn't have hope in some way. And I think that you have to have that, because being a climate denier or a racism denier or white supremacy denier or whatever is as kind of harmful a lot of the time as being like, oh my gosh, what was my brain gone? My brain's just like completely lost what I was going to say. Being a denier is completely as harmful as being, I can't remember what the other half of that. You know what? Maybe one day I'll remember. I have that in my head. That's so annoying. Basically, being in denial can sometimes be as bad as like other things. Wow, eloquence. Wow, I love that I've left it at this note. But basically, we've got to have hope. Hope is action. Hope can be an active thing. And we can create hope ourselves by just being part of the movement and not just like passively hoping that other people will like inject it into life. Like we've got to depend on ourselves.
Thank you so much, Mikaela, and to all of this wonderful panel. I feel very, very honoured to have been able to sit in on this conversation. So thank you so much for coming, and to all the wonderful folks who also turned up in the audience. Thank you for coming. We will be sending out the video of this for anyone who followed the link, but also drop me an email or a message on Shado if you want a recording, because we'll have them at our fingertips. Follow all of these wonderful humans on any device you may have, and I hope everyone has a good evening or day depending on where you've tuned in from, and thanks so much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.